Welcome back to Survey of Biology and our third installment of respiration, and today we're going to look specifically at aerobic respiration. So last time, if you remember, we looked at what happens when there's no oxygen present. So we looked at the anaerobic respiration. So today, what if oxygen is present at the end of glycolysis, as is in the case in humans like us? So aerobic respiration is respiration that requires oxygen. Now you'll notice we said glycolysis is universal. So glycolysis is going to take place whether oxygen is present or not. But now we're going to go through for the cellular respiration and we're going to look what happens when oxygen is present. And the big thing here is we get complete oxidation. We break the glucose down completely. And the other big thing that we see is here's where we get the big energy payback. Do you remember how many molecules of ATP were produced from just anaerobic respiration? Now, it was only 2. And now we're going to get 36 if we can get the complete oxidation. So that allows us to have energy to become more complex, to develop tissue systems, organ systems, and really go beyond the simple bacteria and yeast cells that we talked about with anaerobic respiration. So again, here's the big picture. So up to this point, we've talked about glycolysis that takes place in the cytoplasm. Now we're actually going to get into the mitochondria. So we're going to get into the actual organelle where it takes place. And what we're going to look at today is the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain, which both take place inside the mitochondria, and they produce a lot more of that ATP that we're interested in for the cellular work. So at this point, we're going to move into the mitochondria, and there's one quick step that we have to talk about as we do that, and then everything else will take place in that organelle. So the first thing we need to talk about is called the conversion, or sometimes the transition reaction. And what happens is, as that pyruvate that we have left over from glycolysis moves into the mitochondria, it loses a carbon dioxide. It loses the first carbon as we go through. And one quick thing is, remember, for every molecule of glucose that we started with, we have 2 molecules of pyruvate here because it's been split into that 3 carbon. So there would actually be 2 molecules of CO2 released here. And in the process, we make a little bit more NADH, which, if you recall, is an electron carrier. And we end up with acetyl-CoA, which is a 2-carbon molecule. So now we're going to keep track of carbon. So if you remember, glucose was a 6-carbon molecule, and we just lost 2 carbons through the CO2, and 2 acetyl-CoAs would give us 4 carbons. So everything's accounted for in this reaction. So moving into the mitochondria, if you look at the equation on the top part of the slide here, the 3-carbon pyruvate is converted into a 2-carbon acetyl-CoA, CO2 is removed, and NADH is produced. Now acetyl-CoA, that 2-carbon molecule, is what actually enters the Krebs cycle, where we're going to go to next. So in the Krebs cycle, or sometimes called the citric acid cycle, the same thing is true. So remember, for every glucose molecule that we started with, we've got 2 pyruvates, so this cycle would spin twice. And the same thing, here's where we just got to. We got the acetyl-CoA. Now, what we're going to be right now is carbon accountants. We've got to keep track of all the carbons that come in and go out. So for every 2 carbons that come in the form of acetyl-CoA, we'll see that there is 2 carbons of CO2 that are released. Okay, so if 2 molecules of acetyl-CoA come in, because that's how many would be produced by glucose, we'd have 4 molecules of CO2 actually produced. The other important things to look at here is the cycle. That's why they call it the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle. The acetyl-CoA, which is 2 carbons, gets combined with this molecule called OAA, or oxaloacetic acid. So 4 plus 2 gives us the 6-carbon citric acid. That's where the name citric acid comes from. And this is slowly broken down. So 1 carbon dioxide is removed, we get to a 5-carbon. A 2nd carbon dioxide is removed, we get to a 4-carbon. And the second half of the cycle is just regenerating back to that 4-carbon OAA molecule, so the cycle can continue again. That's the important part about the cycle, is that it does move in this OAA molecule, kind of is where things start and end. The other important thing to look at is we also have ATP and NADH being produced. here as well, and we're going to add a second electron carrier. So here's a new one, FADH2. So this is just another electron carrier. Where is it going to carry the electrons? Well, it's going to carry them to the electron transport chain. So here's a very simplified schematic of cellular respiration. So the citric acid cycle, so when pyruvate goes in, we have 6 carbon dioxides removed, 2 from the conversion reaction, 4 from the Krebs cycle. So all of the glucose is gone. So this accounts for all 6 molecules of carbon that we found in the original glucose. It does produce an additional 2 molecules of ATP. And then the big thing here is we've got FADH and then additional NADH that's going to carry electrons and therefore energy to the electron transport chain. So let's take a look at that next in terms of the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain is where electrons are passed between proteins. So these big green globs in the diagram you can see here are proteins. And what it does is it pumps hydrogens. Those proteins pump protons, and it creates what's called a hydrogen gradient. Because do you see all of these hydrogens on the intermembrane space now? So here's the matrix, the inside of the mitochondria. It pumps all those hydrogens out. It uses the energy from NADH and FADH. They pass their electrons off. And as the electrons get passed from protein to protein, some energy is extracted to pump hydrogen out. Okay? So as the electrons go through, it releases energy. And then the final electron acceptor over here is, here's where all that oxygen that we breathe in comes into play. So every time we take a breath, that oxygen is getting taken to cells so it can carry out this final process. So oxygen is combined with electrons from the electron transport chain, plus hydrogens that are traveling with it, and there's where the water comes from. So now we kind of have all the pieces of the puzzle. At the start of the process, we saw where glucose came in. We saw that we breathe oxygen in from the atmosphere. And now we've seen through the Krebs cycle and the conversion reaction where the carbon dioxide is given off, the glucose is actually broken apart, and now we see where the oxygen that we breathe in allows us to form water that we breathe out as water vapor. So hopefully this kind of brings the cycle, everything back around in terms of the products and the reactants. So now, what's missing from this picture? What are we trying to get from this whole procedure that we don't see in this picture? Hopefully 3 letters come to mind in terms of ATP. And here's the last and final step. Actually, I'm going to go look at this. So here's the final protein in the electron transport chain. So remember we said how all these hydrogens get pumped into the intermembrane space? Well, if we have a lot of hydrogen on the outside and relatively few on the inside, where do they want to move? Okay, well, they want to move back in, don't they? And they move through a special protein called ATP synthase. And what it does is it generates ATP. It's kind of like a revolving door. As the hydrogens flow back in with their gradient, they turn this revolving door, and that's what generates ATP. And this is where the majority of ATP that we get from aerobic respiration comes from. So we harness the potential energy of the proton, the hydrogen gradient, through ATP synthase, and we're just going to generate lots and lots of ATP from that. Well, how many? Well, here's the final breakdown. So if we remember, we go back from the first step, glycolysis, which takes place whether there's oxygen or not. We've got 2 ATP. Okay? If we go back and then look, all of these steps along the way, the NADHs, the FADHs that are being produced, they carry the electrons to the electron transport chain, and all of those electrons, it adds up, and we get a final total of 36 ATP. So that's huge in terms of if you go back and look at what anaerobic respiration gave us, there are 2 ATP. and this is 18 times more. So you can see why aerobic respiration is so much more efficient. And if we're forced to carry out anaerobic as humans, we won't last very long. We'll run out of ATP and we'll die eventually because of that. And the last step that I want to show here and just kind of have you take a look at is everything that we've been talking about so far in terms of energy is coming from where? Glucose, which is a carbohydrate. Well, very rarely are we going to eat just straight sugars or straight glucose. We also eat fats and we also eat proteins. And I just want you to see that the carbons, the nutrients from those can help produce energy as well. So fats, if you remember, glycerol is a 3-carbon molecule. Fatty acids are many carbons. And they get broken down, and glycerol gets filtered in right before pyruvate and converted to pyruvate. Fatty acids can get broken down and fed into the cycle and as 2-carbon acetyl-CoAs. Proteins are the same thing. The amino acids get broken down, the ammonia is removed, and the carbon from those continues on, and they filter into the cycle in many different places. So regardless of the type of food that you're eating, we've focused on glucose and carbohydrates, but fats and proteins will also give us the energy that we need to produce ATP and survive. So that should give you a good picture of cellular respiration. The last segment that we'll look at during our next visit is respiration in terms of the lungs and where does that oxygen getting in. So we'll look at the big picture of respiration and hopefully tie everything together for you.